if Emma would like to say hi.
Hello.
And our central rep, Awish Islam.
Hi, everyone.
We'd like to thank the Canadian Sociological Association for sponsoring this initiative and Sherry Fox, the Executive Director for the CSA, for working with us to plan and organize this series. Today's webinar is titled Casting the Net Wide, Exploring Careers Other Than Faculty Positions, and our guest speaker is Dr. Laura Bisaillon. Laura is a social scientist of medical inadmissibility and HIV-related policy in Canadian immigration law. She is assistant professor in the Interdisciplinary Center for Health and Society and the Department for Social Justice at the University of Toronto, Canada. Her three-time award-winning dissertation has been reformulated into a book, Screening and Screaming in Exile, Medical Examination and the Immigration Health Work of People with HIV, and is currently under review at the University of British Columbia Press. Dr. Bisaillon's broader work examines the medico-legal borderlands in Eritrea, Ethiopia, Iran, and Romania. Thank you very much for joining us today, Laura. Before we begin, I would like to invite audience members to submit any questions that you might have for Laura during this presentation or during the formal Q&A section of the webinar. You can pose questions by using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists, and you may also like questions to prioritize them for Laura. Now, I will turn the webinar over to Laura. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Awish, Emma, and Sherry, the four women with whom I've been coordinating in this last week to prepare to give this webinar for you this afternoon. So thanks for this opportunity, and it is my pleasure because as a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD student at all three levels, I participated in sessions like this. I benefited from them, and I benefited from a lot of good mentoring over the years. So it's my pleasure to sort of reciprocate and make connections with young students, younger than me students and budding sociologists. So thanks again for this opportunity. So this afternoon, what I've planned for us is a webinar in 5 parts, and 6 if you include the last part, which is for me the most exciting, because what we don't want to do when we give a presentation or a webinar is simply to listen to our self-talk. So that last part is geared to have a dialogue with the participants today. So I wish circulated in advance some questions, pressing questions that are on people's minds, and those are listed in the last part of today on the last slide. So I look forward to discussing and interacting with you around questions and comments you have. So so firstly, I prepared 3 questions here. So this is an interaction polling you. If you could begin to answer the first question: what is your current student status, to give me and others an opportunity to see who is on the line? So are you at undergrad, grad, postdoc, other? Second, how would you describe yourself? Are you a positivist or post-positivist sociologist, otherwise known as qualitative or quantitative sociologist? And what experience do you have in research to date? So the choices are there. Oh, terrific. All right, so I see the results. There are a majority PhD, and actually majorities. There are 4 PhD, 1 MA. In terms of who you are, qualitative or post-positivist sociologists in training, and you have experience, all of you have experience in research, and some 2 out of the 5 in teaching. So terrific. So that gives me a great idea as to who you are. And so let's begin. So what does the everyday world of work look like for a university prof in the Canadian context? So what does that look and feel like? So I thought I would begin by responding to this by disclosing the fact that I came to a faculty position as a second career, or it was a career shift for me. So I went back to school in my 30s and completed a PhD at the University of Ottawa. So a faculty position was a new career option for me. I actually didn't know of such a thing before that time. So I suppose what you would call a non-traditional academic, or at least I wasn't a person who went from one degree to the other. I did a bachelor's in political studies at Bishop's University. I studied for a year in France during that time. I then went on after a year's break to get a master's in urban planning at McGill, after which time I practiced for 10 years, and I was practicing in the area of community planning. And I ended up practicing as a social worker or community support worker in Quebec and elsewhere. And that led me actually, so that latter work experience was what led me to go back to school, get a PhD. The degree program was called, it's an interdisciplinary PhD, and my PhD project dissertation contributed to new knowledge in the sociology of organizations, study of professions, and health and illness. So, so I thought it would be useful to talk to you about what it looks like from the perspective of a professor to work in the university. So first of all, I think it's useful to think of the university milieu wearing, with concerns about small p and capital P politics. And let me explain what I mean by this. So when we're entering the university milieu, I mean, what we can do as sociologists, among the best tools that we have are our tools of analysis, right? So our sociologists' toolkit, deploying the skills that we're taught as daily practice of observing, of talking to people, of listening to people. Sort of a professional hazard that we have as sociologists is that we're constantly making the familiar strange. We're connecting the dots, as Charles Mills teaches us to do, right? So we're making links between what we experience, the cultural context in which we're working, the historical context, the sort of policy and structure of relations, and also the geography, right? We know that place matters. Your subcommittee is reflective of that. Halifax is not Vancouver, is not London, is not Toronto, is not Charlottetown. And so where you're working as a university professor really does matter. And we can talk about how and why, and I can talk, sort of deliver and explain a bit more my claim in our Q&A. So what is really helpful when we work as a university professor, what I found really helpful is to turn our skills of sociology, and in particular, I practice institutional ethnography from Dorothy Smith and George Smith's work. And I've practiced since I started at the U of T in 2013 to turn my skills of ethnography and institutional ethnography to the institutional milieu that I'm working in, right? To understand or try to see, first of all, the written and unwritten rules, because there is in medical sciences or in medical training, they talk about the hidden curriculum. And I've put two references at the bottom of the screen here, a piece that I wrote with medical sociologist Joan Eakin a couple of years ago. And that's when I was new at the U of T and coming to grips with the fact that, there are both written rules and unwritten rules. And both of these play a part in shaping what our workplace and therefore our work life look and feel like, right? So the last two bullet points here about being hired and getting acclimatized or used to being a faculty member in the institutional contexts in which we find ourselves. So first of all, there is a legal and a statutory and a policy context that organizes higher education and particular universities in particular ways, right? So there are, labor relations organize, support, and govern our workplaces. And these structural considerations really matter. And what I mean by this is, you know, is there a union or not? Is there a faculty association or not? Those things are not the same, and there are differences between a faculty association and a union when it comes to bargaining power. And both milieus have a collective agreement, but they function a bit differently. So why think about these structural concerns? Well, getting hired. Can we negotiate a salary? In a unionized environment such as York University in Toronto, you can't. In the milieu I entered, you can negotiate your salary. And I did, based on advice from a colleague at McGill, where I did a postdoc who, attending a session such as this said, yes, in Canada, in a non-unionized environment, there is opportunity to negotiate a salary. So that's something to keep in mind. When we're being hired, how much emphasis does the institution place on issues of equity and equity categories? So I applied to Glendon University at York and was interviewed. Before getting this job at U of T, I was interviewed and shortlisted there, and they paid a lot of attention to equity. I was a woman, among other types of categories that I occupy, or positions that I occupy, and I was asked to talk about this, and that was important. That didn't happen in the same way at the U of T. Is the institution you're entering a research or a teaching intensive university? The U of T is a research institution, and so places a lot of emphasis on that, and teaching and less teaching intensive. A small, a university such as Acadia in Willville, Nova Scotia will be what's called a teaching intensive university. So the size and the character of the university matters in terms of what you'll actually be doing. And then lastly, getting acclimatized and knowing what roles and responsibilities are. There is, again, and this relates to whether the institution itself is research or teaching intensive, but there are more and more what are called research streams in which we can be hired, and teaching streams. So a research stream, and that's the stream I'm in, has an allotment or the ratio such as that you see on the screen. So a 40-40-20 that relates to the workload. So 40% of my time is to be spent on research, 40 on teaching, and 20 on service. And we can talk a bit more about what those look like in practice later on. And lastly, let me tell you what Alison Muntz's piece is all about. She published this. She's a feminist geographer, and that's the second link that you see at the bottom of the screen there, her Women on the Edge piece in the Canadian Geographer. A very, very much a must-read for anyone contemplating entering academia, and particularly so for women. It deals with women and gender issues, issues for women, whether they be staff, faculty, or women students. So a must read for any of us, actually. Okay, so let's go on to point number 2. How might I or you work in academia in a position other than a faculty position? And so the sort of organizing thought here is, let's remember that the university is a public space, a public facing space, and it's actually like a physical place, right? So what can we imagine doing at a university as a public place, but also a physical space, other than being faculty, research faculty or teaching faculty? So I brainstormed here, and I thought of the different places that I've studied and all of the people that I've met. Because don't forget, I came late to a faculty position, and so was necessarily interacting with, for the most part, people who are not faculty, right? So that gave me this sort of sociologist's insight into who's then like the heart and the lungs of our institutions, right? So the heart and the reason for being there are the students, but the lungs are like the admin, right? You might see them, you might not. The admin support. I met my husband, who was in the admin of a cégep at which I was teaching in Quebec. So, I mean, key role, but not a faculty role, rather an admin, a support, a role within the institution. The second is the maintenance, all those people who work either as employees to the institution or contractors too, and you can think of maintenance or buildings and grounds, right? Everything from plumbers to architects. And the second link that I've put here, A Day in the Life, is a fascinating article that was put out in University Affairs, which is a magazine that I highly recommend you read. It comes out, I think, every 2 months in Canada. Some great advice for students at your stage or your career stage, as well as anyone else involved in the university system. So this is a day in the life of people who literally cool and heat the buildings in which we circulate. Service, of course, there are cafeterias, though more and more private industry, Tim Hortons and such, rather unfortunately taking up a lot of sort of space on the universities, but there's sort of, you know, there's a food services, there's a security personnel that, you know, are there at the university. And then you can think of all the professions and the trades that go into making our universities, colleges and cégeps the dynamic places that they are or should be or carry the promise of being. You can think of librarians who actually aren't called librarians anymore. They're data scientists, I think. They have a different appellation, but they are in the category, if we think of labor relations, alongside faculty. They have a different union, but they are more and more playing the role of researchers. I've collaborated in research-related ways with 2 librarians at the campus at Scarborough, which I do my teaching. You can think of graphic artists who do all the visuals, and these are you know, professional people whose labor is tied to and whose salary comes from all of the other parts of the university or the campuses that are key to, you know, us learning there or teaching there and being scholars and intellectuals there. And so I just thought I would say, you know, in relation to all of many of the professions and trades or the full-time employees of the universities often actually benefit then from tuition waivers as employees or their offspring. So I mean, that also depends on the institution and the particular, you know, sort of relations, but that's also something I think very useful to keep in mind. And so the first link on this second slide is to point you to an oral history archive of information, or rather of oral history interviews that were taken a couple of years ago at my campus, and that leads you to the page in which all sorts of administrative people and all the categories of different employees that you see here are interviewed. So that gives you a full picture of who is working at the university in positions other than faculty. So let's go on to slide number 3. How might I or you hook what you do in terms of your paid work into the academic labor force? And here, I hope you will find that my ideas are exciting and interesting. I did a big brainstorm to think about what work you might do, putting your skills of sociology, putting your good, you know, social analysts, your sort of intellectual skills into play in ways that are different than faculty, but that support students, support faculty, and support the university. So I think they speak for themselves. There's translation work to do. There's interpretation work. So translation is, you know, the written text from one language to the other, and vice versa. Interpretation, rather, is when we orally interpret from one language to the other. And these are professions, right? So, I mean, you can do them casually, and you can also, you know, go on and get a second degree and then do these with, you know, sort of degrees under your belt. There's massive amounts of editorial work, as you might imagine. So editorial, both for substance and then the copy editing. Faculty are always needing help in these ways. Students, graduate students, are always as well needing help in these ways. And there's also transcription. I didn't put that on here, but transcription's another, when we do interviews or observations, we can hire a transcriber. And then publishing, what was I going to say about publishing publishing industry rather. So, imagining working at a UBC Press or Wilfrid Laurier Press or Fernwood or, within the publishing industry. And I thought it would be important to mention that I do know people with master's and PhD degrees and postdoc experience who are doing all of these works. And so the idea is to sort of think of yourself as either a contractor, a business person, an entrepreneur, and you can look at how to set yourself up in that way. And I've put 3 links here to people, all of whom are women. San Patton is in Nova Scotia. Mina and Jennifer are in Toronto, and San has an MSc. She teaches at Mount Allison as well. Mina teaches as a contractor, and Jennifer graduated with a PhD, had her heart set on a faculty position, and that didn't materialize. And so what they did is they are working in alliance with the university and college system, but they're working differently. So they're putting their skills to use in those 3 ways. And those are sort of very practical alternatives, and then websites that you can look at. And let me just close this slide by saying, if you speak more than 1 language, that is a real asset. And so that can come into play in all of these different types of different places in which to work. If you come from a business sort of family where you have models around that you can sort of learn from to set up a business, this is helpful. The federal and provincial governments also have programs for training men and women, but there's sort of additional training for women to get into private sector of businesses and sort of set up a business model. And I believe that San and Mina, and I think Jennifer, actually the 3 have all benefited in that way. So if you're, you can think of sort of pitching yourself and your skills differently. Okay. So let me come to the 4th slide here. What are effective strategies for finding work inside and outside of the academy? So what I did here is, instead of referring you to job boards, because anyone can do that. Our universities are full of places, sort of databases and things and different sort of resources in that way that you can access. So what I want to do here is to give you some ideas rather perhaps outside the box here. So think of yourself and what you can do and what you can offer. Think of this sort of small s and capital S. So the small social and the small social and capital S social. What I mean by that is your sort of the personal skills, but then also you as situated within a society that's working in particular ways, right? So let me make these 5 comments. First is about the embodied nature of work, right? That we all live in a body. We're first a person before we're a professor, a student, a mother, a wife, these sort of things, right? So we live in a body, and my biggest advice, actually, that sort of at the level of a paradigm would be to imagine yourself at 40. So you're in your 20s, I presume. Now, imagine yourself at 40 or 45, and what do you want your body to be doing? Do you want to work in a lab? Do you want to work underwater? Do you want to work in Mongolia? Do you want to work in Glace Bay, Cape Breton? Do you want to work on Vancouver Island? Where do you want to work, and what do you want to be doing? And that is a great benchmark to work back from. Think about patterns, historical patterns, and really always socialize and historicize questions about searching for work, right? So we know from how capitalism is that there are always boom and bust periods. We know that there are always people who will be unemployed, contractual, and full-time. These are cyclical, right? We do know that since the 80s, the trend toward precarious temporary work has intensified. Our universities have become places of admin and audit to their peril and to our peril, the workers and students within them. However, those are patterns, right? And as sociologists, we can think and study, okay, what can I do and how can I think historically, and how can I put that to use? 3 is about focus, right? I do think that social media and our practices have already done us a disservice, or perhaps even been the death of us, right? We are too distracted collectively. Multitasking isn't good for us. It's not good for our bodies, our minds, or our morale. And so there is a busyness that we need to talk back to, and we really need to think about how we use our time, and we need to be careful not to become overloaded by information. Information isn't the same thing as thinking, as analyzing, as knowledge. The last 2 points here is seek to inspire and be inspired. I've been inspired by tremendous women in particular who are particularly generous in universities since I began in this faculty position. So take the opportunity to give and take in that way. And last is to keep in mind that work and future work and current work are, what we do is a means to an end and not an end in itself, right? So this idea of Protestant work ethic and working until you drop, particularly intense in the city in which I moved to for this job is Toronto, this sort of idea of that you should always be working, really do challenge that. Work rather is a means to an end. And here there are 3 terrific sources. An article that colleagues and I from 6 different countries have in press in feminist studies, and that's in press now. And I put it here not to be modest, but rather to have you keep that in mind. And that really is born out of the experience of systemic sort of fatigue and the need, we argue, to do things differently and to practice differently when we're doing academic work and when we're working in whatever way within the academy at this point in time. The second is Turner's recent set of essays on silence and the value of silence and being still and observing, which is something we do very well as sociologists, right, is talking to people and listening and being circumspect in what we say. And last is a book that I'm reviewing currently for Sociology of Health and Illness, and it's called The Work Cure. It is totally mind-blowing. I really recommend reading it. And it really questions this fascination and fixation we have on work as something in the latch to the paid labor force. All right, rapidly coming to the end, almost out of time. Let me go to the last slide here. And that is, this is something that I put here because this idea of strength-based pedagogy and working to our strengths is something that has really changed my outlook to life in the university, life as a researcher, life as an educator. In all ways, it's really been dramatic, actually. It's really what we would say is an ontological shift, an opportunity that this type of reconfiguration of my own thinking and practicing has stimulated. So let me say, as the sort of guide to orienting to this particular slide, is to really encourage you to identify what you're good at, and work towards that, right? So we all have strengths. We live at a moment in time that is rather, rather chaotic, unfortunately to the right, but where as well we often find ourselves working from a place of, how to say this, we sort of, rather than a productive or a generative sort of frame or lens for orienting, very much the opposite, right? From a deficit or an extractive critique way of thinking and seeing and knowing and relating to each other. So I'm wanting to suggest that park all of that and think about yourself as having strengths, identify those, and work to those. And an example from my practice is that I happen to like to work cooperatively with students and with colleagues, not always recognized or valued by the institution, but I persist in working collectively because I believe that we do our best work collectively. And so I've become good at that, sort of in galvanizing and interesting people to work collectively. I happen to not be a great manager of people. And so when I entered this faculty position, I needed to learn how to manage TAs and work with RAs and manage large classrooms as small classrooms, right? So that relates to that second point about, a reflexive reality check. We can't say we're good at everything because we're not, right? We have a lot of strengths, but we also obviously have some, weaknesses or things that we don't like doing or that we're not good at doing. One thing that I never learned doing my PhD or my postdoc work was how to manage a budget, how to create a budget, how to manage a budget. You hit a faculty position or you work for a prof and you're asked to, okay, make this budget, do a timeline because I'm applying for this grant. And you think, gosh, at least that was never part of my training. So that is something that I needed to develop skills around and did so when I, was in this position. And again, this idea of mentoring and being mentored. We do our best work collectively. History shows us that. We can be generous and kind. We are humans first and workers second. And being a good intellectual and a good scholar is in every way consistent with being a kind and a generous colleague. So I'm going to just end with a quote that I have here on my computer, and it's an excerpt from. It's an excerpt that I happened to find somewhere. So let me just read this. A young professor had just joined Cambridge University faculty and was visiting the senior common room for the first time. He was nervous about all the famous and accomplished people he would meet and wanted to fit in and not make an ass of himself. He was greeted and overawed by Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, who said to him, quote, "Don't try to be clever. Everyone here is clever. Instead, try to be a little kind." So the last two sources on this slide, on that previous slide, are the first is Finn's book, where he challenges us to think with equal doses, critically and creatively, and Richard Freistadt, who's a prof and a pedagogue at Berkeley in the United States, where you can find more information about strength-based pedagogy, and the specific link to the seminar that I found so mind-blowing that I referenced earlier. All right. With no further ado, we'll go to the last slide, and then it's us, and it's in dialogue. As I mentioned, I wish Nicole and Emma sort of collected questions that you had over the last number of months since January, and here are some of the points that I developed in answer to the list of questions. And so actually I don't have speaking points for these so much as to show that, I guess as the professor, I did my homework to prepare, but it was sort of answers to some of the questions that you were asking. So sort of, what is the difference between, a sort of a PhD and an MA level study, and how much can we then talk about what we know and what we've done and how we've contributed when we emerge having taken a master's versus a doctoral, and is it worth, sort of pursuing graduate studies at this point? again, the second point, I've made a strong lobby to you to really constantly question, ask questions, observe, and to orient in a challenging way to any institutional milieu that you enter, right? I mean, academia is actually organizationally not so unlike, this is going to sound very weird, but you can imagine, the armed forces or the prison system or the immigration system or the priesthood. These are sort of big bureaucracies, right? As sort of Goffman and they're sort of totalizing institutions, and we do well when we orient as sociologists with that sort of level of acumen to try to understand what's going on in the places. Sociology skills are always like they're key to being a human, right? We, unlike the former Prime Minister Harper, who were just not to practice sociology. Of damn it, we always need to practice sociology because those are core skills, human skills. So they're skills of that are very much humanistic. There was a question about, right, I'm an international student, and so can I get hired? It is the case that Canadian universities are in their policy, infrastructure mandated to prioritize those with PR and citizenship. In terms of a graduate degree, and then when we converse, I know there's most of you have PhDs or are in training to get PhDs on the line, and then one or two have master's degrees, but a graduate, just to make the point that graduate studies are harder, they're more intense, they're more demanding personally and professionally, and so it's a big decision, and it's a decision financially, right, to decide to pursue higher studies. And so I think I'll take a slug of water and close there by saying, if you have other sort of these practical questions about networking, how to connect, what about full-time, part-time work, if I'm starting a family or I'm a family person or I travel, how does college and university teaching compare or researching compare? Should I publish in scholarly journals if I'm not, planning to go on to university work? Here I might make it's not a plug actually, but I've published 4 pieces in the online publication called The Conversation, which you might know, which is a great place to publish. It's an evidence-based or a scholarly-based online form that's supported by a network of our Canadian institutions, and that gives voice to, intended to put informed or evidence-based or research-based, pieces out there into the world. And as long as you're affiliated with the university, you can contribute to the Conversation Canada. All right, that's it. That's a wrap.
Okay, thank you so much, Laura, for your excellent presentation. We will now turn to the questions period for this presentation. So I'll be reading out the questions the audience has submitted through the Q&A function, as well as some questions that we have received in advance of the webinar. So I'm going to start off with this first question that you guys have posed. What sort of job titles do you look for when searching for jobs outside of academia? For example, data analyst or research assistant. What should we be looking for?
Again, that comes back to what you want to do, right? So you can imagine that you'll have several careers, and that's nothing new actually. So the idea that you will have several careers within your lifetime, I mean, that's been my experience. And so you want to think back from what you actually want to do. So if you like data analysis, it seems to me it would make sense to try to get into the public service. You could work with government at one of the 3 levels, for example, right? You could also work within community organizations and propose yourself as, as a social analyst. So I think that those, I think that's the advice that I would have there is and sort of speak about yourself as, if that analysis interests you, then, sort of talk about yourself as a social analyst, and then you want to sort of emphasize what you then can bring to the organization in terms of those skills and what that looks like.
Okay, great. Another question that we've been offered is, how important is networking and having an online presence on websites like LinkedIn? Do you find that these help in terms of finding jobs or when you are seeing individuals applying for jobs?
Okay, so LinkedIn isn't used by university people generally. So it's not a site. I have a LinkedIn profile, but that if you look up my LinkedIn profile, you will see that it's not. I've tailored that for viewers outside of the academic milieu. So you know. And that's because I had a prior career and I am open to opportunities for, consulting and doing other work in addition to my university work. So LinkedIn isn't used by scholars, academics, generally speaking. The sites that are useful, there's ResearchNet, there's academia.edu. These are not without their controversy because of how much data you want to share, who owns the data, all these sorts of things. There's like sort of, those positions, polarized positions on whether these are valuable, good or bad places to have our data or whether they're valuable. I have found academia.edu to be helpful. I've had a place there for 10 years. I wouldn't say that I use it so much. I did at a time. But it's there. The last thing I'll say is that I have, and it's perhaps a career stage, but also an age and a real fatigue of being online and being interacting with computer is this sort of I do not have any other online place for my my academic profile is confined and limited to my University of Toronto webpage. So I use the university as the spot to which I refer people. And yeah, I do that related to the earlier points that I made about, sort of not oversaturating or overloading myself and others with info.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Another one of our participants has asked, does the US provide more jobs outside of academia than Canada?
I suppose because the country is so much bigger. Now the question is, do you want to live in the United States? Again, imagine yourself in 5, 10, 15, 20 years, where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? Whose society do you want to grow? Whose society do you want to participate in? Whose society can you participate in if you're a racialized person, if you're a woman, if you're any, whatever your social position is? I really, really think long and hard whether you want to go to the United States. I mean, the U of T in particular is an institution that has, since the last war, hired, US academics in droves, not without critique, but that says something about the societies south of the borders. They're very different societies, US and anywhere else in the world, actually. So really think about where you want to work, what geography and what political geography and context you want to work in, and the labor relations once you get there. Maternity leave conditions, daycare conditions, all these sorts of things, because you'll presumably want to start families. Those are serious, think of the material conditions of the place you'll want to end up beyond the job.
Great. Sort of building off some of the conversation that we had previously, this speaks a little bit to student qualifications and what your degree can get you. Also, I think it also speaks to problems that graduate students might have around imposter syndrome. So one of our participants asked, I find it difficult to identify practical skills that I've developed during my MA that employers might be looking for, and I often feel like I'm not qualified for entry-level jobs. Do you have any suggestions for identifying skills or overcoming these hurdles?
Yeah, in terms of the imposter syndrome, I wouldn't. I heard this word about 10 years ago, and I think very few people in academia don't have it. So I would just say park that, and don't give that too much thought. Perhaps easier said than done, but don't worry about it. I mean, men, perhaps white men in particular have a lot less issue with this sort of idea of imposter syndrome, right? Or English language speakers within an English language majority cultural context have less issues with this imposter syndrome thing. But I think don't go into the rabbit hole of becoming overly attentive to that. It's a thing, yes, but it can't override you or zap your all that you can offer. So to the very practical matter of talking about yourselves in skills, of course, it's not always evident, the skills that we do have, and it's very helpful to see ourselves through the eyes of others. And so let me give you a very specific example, is that in the last while, I've taken to having an academic mentor. And so I haven't always had an academic mentor. In fact, very recent. I've been at the U of T 6 years, but it's only in the very recent, as I'm anticipating applying for tenure, that I've managed to find an academic mentor. Her name is Professor Bakan, Abigail Bakan. She's at the Faculty of Education and Social Justice. And I asked her to sit with me and talk about my CV. And she did. And it was so illuminating because she saw me through the performance of that document, and she was able to see things that I hadn't seen, and also very practically like go over my CV and say, no, this, honestly, I started from scratch, because she said the way that you've presented things is not the way it needs to be, right? So when you're applying for tenure, your CV should look in a certain way and not in others. And so and actually what I had done, it's interesting, and I think this is relevant to mention here, she in her assessment, she found that I combined sort of a professional CV with an academic CV. So there were mixtures, because they're two different conventions or like types of writing, right? And so, you either have a professional CV, which is actually, if you go onto my LinkedIn profile, that's the type of CV that I have there, right? But that's not the same CV that I'm going to show to like my boss, or, the next time I meet Professor Bakan, right? So I needed to have her assess and say, no, this is good, but this is bad within the document, and reformulate it. So that's what I can say there is get good guidance. And that comes back to the idea of modeling good practice, and then being open to criticism and critique, which is not always easy, but it's like totally part of it. And then reaching out for mentors and have them help you, and then help others when you're in a position like me to then, pay it forward.
Okay, this next question I think builds nicely off of the last one, and I think we might have room for just one or two more. So this question is, we've been speaking a lot about jobs that relate to academia, but are there different strategies for finding jobs outside of academia that you've noticed?
Different strategies rather than the positions that I talked about. Okay. Well, this is classic. Even when I was in my 20s, I was, confronted with having to search. The thing that's different between the society in which I was in my 20s and your societies now is that there is an overabundance of information, right? So that we all become distracted, and perhaps reality can become distorted. So I think, returning to why I titled today's talk the way I did, casting the net wide, and that sort of analogy is that you need to cast it wide when you're looking for work, but you also cannot exhaust yourself by looking too wide. And so you need to find sort of a balance there. So there are all sorts of databases. I've never had success through them, to be honest. There are, that's a way of applying for work. There are, there's the idea of sending your CV in cold or making cold calls. That I think is the cold calling. I don't know if it's still practice. It was a thing back in the day. So I would say, we do know that, people get jobs through their networks. So this idea of, trying to know people and following labor trends and labor market trends and letting friends know that you're looking for work and being sort of resourceful in that way, I think are helpful personal skills.
Okay, it looks like we do have time for one more quick question. So how long does it take for you to find your first academic job after graduating? Maybe you can speak to this from your own experience or from students or others that you've worked with that have graduated and gone on to find jobs outside of academia.
Yeah, and it's a good question because I track what the students at the U of T, it's so big, so there's so many students that I see, but of the students that I keep in touch with and remain close to after they graduate, I track them, like I keep track of them, I should say, right? So it's easy to do through Facebook. I have 3 pages in which that I moderate for 3 specific courses, but that gives me a chance to keep in touch with them. And so I know one student who was not born in Canada, actually, who now has permanent residence. He is working in private industry. He's working in health insurance, the health insurance milieu. Another student applied within the U of T for an admin position, and she got that right out of graduating. So that was graduating with her BA. So the 2 students I've mentioned here both came out of their BAs. Let me think. There's a colleague who didn't do a postdoc with me. She's currently at Dalhousie in where Emma is. She's doing a postdoc and she's on the job market. And so she's in her second postdoc and then looking for work at the same time. And postdocs are intense times because you spend half of your time looking for work and then half of your time doing your sort of scholarship. So I wonder if that answers your question. And then there's no specific answer to how long it takes because the market is what it is, and timing and sort of serendipity and being at the right place at the right time is simply what we can count on in life more generally. So how long it takes, it's sort of anyone's guess. All we can do and what we can control is how we prepare ourselves and how we present ourselves. And that's, the idea that the earlier questions about websites and preparing different sorts of CVs and being active and being, in participating in the life of sociology and, and in other professional milieus. I hope that answers the question.
I think it gives some information to that question. I actually think that we have time for just one more. And this, I think, can be a quick response of yes or no, and then why. So if I take a non-academic job, am I still a sociologist?
I love that question. Yes, you are. Of course you are. Once a sociologist, once you've trained and once you have, your skills of observation and analysis, and you understand how to cross paradigms, and you're constantly questioning and observing. I mean, incidentally, my degree isn't in sociology, and so to use the lingo as it is now, how I identify, I most certainly identify. Not only do I identify as a sociologist, I claim and I am a sociologist. Why? Is because I do all the things a sociologist do. This is how I socialize professionally. This is where, sort of I publish, who I associate with, how I've done research, how I work individually and collaboratively. So, your discipline and your disciplinary label is one thing, and then how you are in the world is there's sort of, if that makes sense, 2 parts of the same thing. So yes, you are a sociologist, or whatever. Once a sociologist, always a sociologist.
Great. I think that's what we all like to hear.
Yeah.
So just for wrapping up, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thank you, Laura, for your presentation and for addressing our questions. A recording of this webinar will be posted online at students.csa at our webpage, along with responses to any questions that we did not have time to address here. Audience members will be receiving a feedback survey from us, so we'd really appreciate it if you could please fill that out. And we will see you all next time, and thank you so much for your participation. Bye, everyone.